أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم استغفر الله ربي وأتوب إليه الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على خير خلقه وخاتم الأنبياء والمرسلين سيد الأولين والآخرين شفيع المذنبين رحمة للعالمين محمد وآله الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين اللهم صل ربنا لا تزغ قلوبنا بعد إذ هديتنا وهب لنا من لدنك رحمة إنك أنت الوهاب. Assalamu alaikum, my dear brothers and sisters. It is an honor to serve you all again, and I see a lot of familiar faces. Inshallah, whatever small contribution I make is accepted by the Almighty, and may we learn together, inshallah. The title for these next 5 nights is the fourth Imam's intellectual and spiritual contribution after Karbala. So my niyat basically is to specifically examine what this Imam has offered us for today. What kind of works has he left us, which I'm sure you all know, al-Sahifa, al-Sajjadiyyah and Risalat, al-Huquq. Second, to appreciate what he went through, the suffering he went through. And third, to see if we can build some models for humanity from what he has left us. Maybe models for education, maybe models for human rights, models for human dignity. We all know that Yazid ibn Muawiyah was the representation of indignity. Sunni and Shi'a historians, of course, as you know, talk about his barbaric conduct, his intoxication, his abuse of other people, the way he used to treat animals even. So he was the complete opposite of Al-Husayn alayhi salam. And we obviously narrate this every Muharram or Arba'in. But the deeper question is, how did a surviving Imam who could have had a negative response to the event of Karbala, how did he actually bear that suffering and guide the Muslim community and guide them in a way so as to give them back their dignity and to show them that accepting such a ruler is not befitting for a society? This is the crux question. Now, it's very easy, as I have said, or hinted perhaps, to look at the fourth Imam and to look at the event of Karbala as only tragic. We don't usually use the word victorious when looking at Karbala. Now, you may argue, of course, that we may not be praying today, Muslims may not be praying today, or praying correctly even, had it not been for the sacrifice of Al-Husayn alayhi salam. So there is a victory associated with Karbala, which is his sacrifice, allowed us to reconnect with our fundamentals, one. But second is, when you look at the fourth Imam, what was victorious about him, Jazakallah, on a personal level? And I find this particularly interesting. Okay, thanks. Salawat, please. What I find interesting on a personal level is that when we look at Imams, it is easy to say that, well, he's the Imam. Al-Husayn alayhi salam said, "O son, you are not to fight with me, you have to guide the Muslim community." So it is expected for him to be patient, it's expected for him to be a leader. But this takes away every ounce of courage, every ounce of distress and anguish and strength that he had to endure to guide the community. If we are to analyze Imams, we have to first and foremost appreciate their humanness. Exactly what was their response to suffering? What was their philosophy of suffering? If you open al-Sahifa, al-Sajjadiyyah, you'll find very beautiful du'as. Now I'm going to tackle this, I think, tomorrow, inshallah. But you'll find that the du'as are so different that the approach to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is philosophically different in each dua. You will find, for example, although I'll talk about this tomorrow, in I think dua number 1, you will find the Imam talking about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in such a grand, such an objective way that he says that no intellect, no eyes can ever comprehend Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. We simply cannot, all right? He's giving that glorification to Allah. But then, if you look at some of the munajats which are there, which were compiled afterwards, he talks about Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in such a way that he wants to taste the sweetness of his love. And he wants his eyes to see Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Now, how do you reconcile this? On the one hand, he's saying, Allah, you are so grand, you deserve all this praise. But on the other hand, he's saying, no, Allah, I want to see you, and I want to taste the sweetness of your love. Okay, this is two examples. A third example. In one of the du'as, which in my humble view is explicitly related to Karbala, he talks, or rather, the tone of the du'a is full of anguish, full of anger, and full of distress. The du'a is supplicating, he's supplicating to Allah, O Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He says, cut the size of their armies, he says. Destroy my enemies, okay? He says words like that, which shows that he was feeling so much pain after Karbala that he was supplicating to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to exact some sort of justice in the society because of what his family and the righteous people went through. Now, if you look at this, it shows his various feelings. It shows his understanding of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Ya Mujib, he keeps saying in some of the munajats. He wants Allah to respond to his state. If we regard these Imams, and in particular the fourth Imam, as important, and we say that look at these beautiful works that he has left us, well, we have to take it seriously. We have to specifically examine what was his response, and in his words, what kind of things can we build from these words for our own situation today in 21st century. That is why I mentioned things like education or human dignity, things which he has talked about. Now this is the theme of the lectures, inshallah, and I will build it up. So in this lecture I'll talk about suffering. In the next two lectures I'll talk about al-Sahifa, al-Sajjadiyyah, specifically du'as. In the last two, it will be some contemporary themes, inshallah. Salawat. I want to begin actually with something that is reported in Biharul Anwar. This is a statement by Al-Husayn alayhi salam to Imam Sajjad alayhi salam. These are farewell words which one Imam leaves to another, or if you want to put it more plainly, a father to a son. Okay? This is what he says. This is what Imam Sajjad narrates. He says, my father held me to his chest on the day he was killed. While it was a critical situation, he said, "O my dear son, learn from me a prayer that my mother Fatima instructed me, and she had been instructed by the Prophet of Allah, who was in turn taught by Angel Jibreel, peace be upon them all. And this dua is for when you are in need and when you need help, and when you have intense grief and intense calamity and unbearable disaster." Okay? Now before I go into the dua, whether you want to accept this tradition or not, you can imagine that a father would say this to his son. Now, if you want to cross-reference, and I have some statements here, which inshallah if I've got time I'll read out. Imam alayhi salam, before his death in letter 31, says a similar things to his son, Al-Hasan and Al-Husayn alayhi salam, or Muhammad ibn Hanafiya, depending on reports. He says a similar thing. It means the father is training his son that in the event of utmost calamity, how do you bear suffering? How do you bear disaster? Now for us, this becomes even more intimate because we know that we are talking about Karbala. So you can imagine with a heavy heart how Imam Hussain alayhi salam must have talked to his son and what the son would have received. This is in a way painful to say, okay? But what it shows is that the fourth Imam alayhi salam was living in suffering and died in suffering. When we talk about courage in Karbala, our minds automatically, even in our Maqtal and Gambayan, it has been like this. We always go through the physical sacrifice and the physical martyrdoms by the shuhada, which is fine, of course. But what about the sacrifice of this Imam? This was a mental kind of, combat. This was mental combat against suffering, and physical, because he was in chains when he was taken to Kufa and Damascus. Now, to endure that of the heart is another type of suffering which we don't always talk about. So there is a physical and there is this kind of spiritual and mental suffering which our poor Imam is going through. So imagine him receiving the words and he can't fight. This is with a heavy heart he's taking it. And what is this dua? I'll just read a line out, and if I've got time I'll read some more. He says, Bihaqqi Yasin, this is the dua, by the truth of Yasin, wal Quran al-Hakim, and the wise Quran, wa bihaqqi Taha, and the truth of Taha, wal Quran al-Azim, and the mighty Quran, ya man yaqdiru ala hawaijus sa'ilin, oh, by the one who determines and fulfills the needs of the askers. Okay? So already he's telling Imam Sajjad alayhi salam, this is a dua for you to recite. We are almost taking an oath by these things, by the Quran, for example, by Taha, by these mysterious realities which we don't always know about, by this godly reality, you are acknowledging that there is somebody out there who is going to respond to your needs. What does that mean? Have confidence. Be positive in Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and ask Him, do not lose hope after me. If we ever think that the Imams are expected to do something, that is incorrect. The Imams are trained in their spiritual and philosophical understanding of the world in order that they have the confidence to be an Imam and the confidence to spread the appropriate message of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. He is giving him that confidence. The dua continues. O one, ask by the following. O one who knows the contents of the soul. O reliever of the distressed. O soother of the grieved. O one who is merciful to an elderly person. O sustainer of a little baby. O one who never needs any interpretation. Bless Muhammad and the progeny of Muhammad. And then he tells Imam Sajjad, ask for your needs. Okay? What he's saying is, this being Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is a sustainer for you. How is it that a baby that comes out of the mother is sustained? By the grace of Allah, that through the mother and the milk of the mother and the love of the mother, as the manifestation of the mercy of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, that baby is sustained. Even then, babies generally are resilient. When we look at the world and we look at how frail we are, we see that there is a sustainer who is able to sustain us. Therefore, the advice given to Imam Sajjad alayhi salam is very specific and specific to his situation. Now, I'm going to deal with this in the next two lectures, but it shows that du'as have contexts. When we recite du'as in community, they have contexts. Some du'as are not appropriate for occasions. Some du'as are more appropriate. Some du'as we will recite, for example, we will recite dua al-iftitah every day in Ramadan. Fine, it's a wonderful dua. But if you were to open al-Sahifa al-Sajjadiyyah, you will see that there's a dua for the beginning of Ramadan, a dua for the end of Ramadan as well, and possibly, I think, another dua for Ramadan as well. But there are two main ones which I have read, okay? We never recite these duas in public, unfortunately. But these duas, by the way, are so clever that you will not find these kind of duas with the other Imams. Why? Why is it that the case? Because Imam Sajjad alayhi salam, because he was in chains, literally his neck was in chains, because he could not express his imamat, what did he do? This was the cleverness of the fourth Imam. He taught how to fast in the dua. He taught what is more important in fasting, and he explicitly says that observing the spiritual and moral aspects of the fast over the legal aspects of the fast, that means the refraining from eating and drinking and other things, is not that important. It's a fiqh rule, but what is more important is not backbiting. What is more important is disciplining your nafs. Now, if we were living in the time of the fourth Imam and we were listening to this, we would be educated through a dua that the Umayyad regime did not know about. We would be educated, like in this gathering. If the fourth Imam is here, he would be teaching us through the dua how to fast. Because he cannot go on the pulpit and express these things. Today, alhamdulillah, I can give a lecture or you can give a lecture to me. We are relatively free. But in that time, no. It took 60 years for the Umayyad regime to collapse. One, because of the great efforts of Bibi Zainab salamullahi alayha, and of course of the efforts of the fourth Imam. Because of the concept of the majalis as training and instruction. Training and instruction, right? So therefore, when you look at the fourth Imam, the du'as come from a context. Now I have said this even in UK, but we should try to recite the du'as from al-Sahifa in Ramadan in order to teach us how to fast. Because dua al-iftitah will accomplish one thing only. It will accomplish the objectiveness and the praiseworthy traits of Allah. But it will not teach you how to fast. It won't. Because the dua is for something else. But the du'as in As-Sahifa will teach you how to be a human being. This is the beauty of the fourth Imam. Even in the first dua of As-Sahifa al-Sajjadiyyah, he talks about the concept of insaniya. Now, insaniya we may translate today as humanity. Now, if you were to go back in the Islamic tradition and say, is there an equivalent concept to human rights and human dignity, you may not find a term like that. But there is a term like that in As-Sahifa. He talks about insaniya, the idea of humanity. And you can imagine today, when Islam in the media is completely attacked, and we are portrayed as a barbaric religion and barbaric Muslims and all these unfortunate things, we have some of these beautiful things within the Islamic tradition telling us that the fourth Imam was acutely aware that when he saw barbarism, that means through the barbarism of Yazid, he did the exact opposite and portrayed a message to tell Muslims, and inshallah whoever came after, that actually no, Islam is to do with insani of humanity. Salawat, please. So let us perhaps appreciate what we mean by suffering. I have a sort of definition here. I don't want to bore you, but let me just give you this. And this is specifically related to Islamic tradition. Suffering is the struggle a being goes through in its life. Because I'm talking about human being and jinn as well. Suffering is a struggle of a being that goes through in its life when it is met with difficulties of all kinds, mental, intellectual, spiritual, in order to become nearer to Allah, to understand His supreme merciful will, and to obtain true contentment in this life and the next. The definition of suffering or musibah, is not struggling in a vacuum. In other traditions, especially non-religious traditions, suffering to some degree is in a vacuum. That means we struggle and we must remove our suffering. That is why, for example, when you look at euthanasia, okay, and you look at sort of voluntary taking life, you look at suicide, this is a response to suffering, which is to remove suffering immediately. Right? There isn't a conception of a hereafter. There isn't a conception of a merciful will or a merciful Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. The things that we see that we do not believe in, like suicide and such things, is because we have a different response to suffering. Otherwise, we would say, oh, these things are fine. But we say they're not fine simply because we are placing all of our suffering within some framework. And that framework is a sense of becoming nearer to Allah and realizing our self-worth actually. A simple example. I've come here, so it's a long plane journey, I'm leaving my family or children or whatever it is, and therefore that is some sense of suffering, okay? But I would not realize your beautiful personalities or the relationships I build or whatever small contribution I make or whatever I learn from all of you, I would not be able to experience any of that had I not made the journey here. We do exams before our professional degrees and qualifications, and we may not like exams, but we finish them in order that we realize the worth of our degree and the worth of our qualification. We are born in suffering. A baby comes out, needs the mother. Everything is associated with suffering. It's a natural human condition since the time of Adam alayhi salam. Okay? Whether we bring it on ourselves through our desires, or whether it's propelled on us, doesn't really matter. But when the situation does come, what is important in the Islamic tradition is to put that suffering within a framework that helps us understand what is actually happening to us. Why do I have so much wealth or less wealth? Why am I a leader? A leader, by the way, is also a position of suffering, just to let you know. Because, no, really, in letter 53, if you read that letter of Malik al-Ashtar, at the beginning, and I'm sure some of you have read this, Imam al-Islam tells Malik al-Ashtar, this position of leadership that you have is a test from your Lord. It's a test. In order that you curtail your own desires and do not go by the whims of shaitan. In order that you treat your subjects with respect. And you think, why do I want to be a leader? Well, forget it. You know, it's like that. It's a huge responsibility. So what we may perceive as positive or important, to be honest, may not really be that important or positive. In fact, it's the negative thing which we have to respond to. And vice versa, either way. Sometimes it's good having an illness because it helps us realize our health. Okay? In that sense, what the Islamic tradition does beautifully, and also other religious traditions, it helps us understand suffering. What does the Quran say about suffering? And throughout the whole Quran, there are certain verses, but I've chosen one surah which naturally encapsulates suffering, naturally, which is Surah Al-Inshirah. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Alam nashrah laka sadrak wa wada'na anka wizrak. Did we not open your breast for you, or your chest for you, and relieve you of your burden? Alladhi anqada dhahrak, which almost broke your back. Wa rafa'na laka dhikrak. Did we not exalt your name? فَإِنَّ مَعَ الْعُسْرِ يُسْرًا إِنَّ مَعَ الْعُسْرِ يُسْرًا. Indeed, ease accompanies hardship. Indeed, ease accompanies hardship, Allah says. فَإِذَا فَرَقْتَ فَانْصَبْ. So when you are done with a point, وَإِلَىٰ رَبِّكَ فَارْغَبْ. And turn eagerly to your Lord. This surah, although very short, tells us one thing. Allah is aware of suffering, and He is aware that within His will, He may be directing that suffering as well. He's acutely aware of it. Don't you know this? I mean, I'm aware of this. And don't you know that through your hardship, through this hardship, that you are being exalted? Don't you also know that there is ease after your hardship? Look at, even within these few lines, Allah is telling us that there is some consequence, and a good consequence after suffering, whether we realize it or not. And ultimately, as it indicates at the end of the surah, we are to nominate or recognize Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. And hence, one of the beautiful things which all the Imams had, and I believe they were trained in this, is the trait of sabr, of patience. You rarely found them. I mean, I gave the example of that dua of the fourth Imam, which shows his anguish. But it is not a complaining, it's not a complaint to Allah. But you will not find them complaining with a sense of irritability and anger at the affairs that Allah gave them. You look at Al-Husayn alayhi salam. You look at his sermons on his journey to Karbala. You look at his conversations with his sons and his family. He accepted the fate given to him. This is the fate that Allah has destined for me. Tawakkaltu Allah. I trust Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is what he says in the dua in the morning of Ashura. He says, I am trusting Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. That requires absolute resilience. We talk about the physical bravery of Al-Husayn Islam. That physical bravery cannot be there without dua, without that sense of recognizing who Allah is and why this suffering is happening. The real bravery is the bravery of the heart of Husayn al-Islam and the heart of Imam Sajjad al-Islam. This is where the rest of that physical bravery comes. Salawat, please. Let us go a bit deeper. What does a hadith say about suffering actually? This is a hadith about a Prophet, peace upon him. It's reported in Tuhaf al-Uqul as well as Biharul Anwar. And he says something very interesting. He says, the most examined people are the prophets followed by their likes. You pick any prophet, Prophet Yusuf alayhi salam, Prophet Yaqub, all of them undergo some kind of suffering. losing a son, being distant away from Prophet Yaqub, for example, or Prophet Yunus being trapped in a whale. All of these things are suffering. He continues, a faithful believer is afflicted according to the degree of his loyalty, believing and good deed. Those who enjoy a true iman and good deeds will be intensely afflicted, while those who bear insignificant faith and commit evil doings are afflicted trivially. What does that mean? I really like this hadith. I'll tell you why. Because when I reflect on it on my own personal life, if somebody is insulting to me, I have a right to retort to him. I can. He's done dhulm on me. I can say, excuse me, you have no right to say that to me, and I can go and retort to him. This is my moral right in front of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. It's my moral right to do that. But what is the Prophet saying? He's saying, if you have faith, if you have a patience, and you bear that insult, you will be afflicted even more. Because when you go home, you will not like it. I didn't say anything. And you still feel angry. You might go and throw something, okay? But it's better to throw something than go and insult. So you break your vases, it's fine, yeah? But if you bear that, it means that you are not doing the same dhulm to that other religious believer or human being. You are not like that person. And you are protecting your soul from that injustice. Because once you retort, then you are allowing that injustice to fester in your soul until you yourself become frustrated and angry. Rather, what the Prophet is saying, bear that. Because if you bear that, you are regarded as a faithful person in front of Allah. And hence, the most brash person, the most insulting person, the person that already will give that due to the other person, whilst it may seem, oh, look how brave, look how courageous that person is, look how bold that person is, it's not actually boldness. That is a sign of weakness, because that person has not protected his or her soul, and rather he should have been patient in the face of the suffering dealt to him. So the Prophet goes a bit deeper in that sense, or if you like, clarifies or specifies the Quran, saying that bearing the suffering is greater than retorting back or acting directly in the face of suffering. And that again is perhaps a lesson to us all, inshallah. What do philosophers say about suffering? If we are to understand, and this will be the conclusion later on, how Imam Sajjad responds to suffering, if you look within the Islamic tradition, there are many philosophers that I can quote, but I just want to quote a few. Ibn Sina in Isharat wa Tanbihat, Remarks and Admonitions Part 4, where he talks about irfan. He says that the greatest happiness in a human being's life, and the first, the awwal, is Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. I might find my wife or my family or this community to be a happiness for me, but it's not real happiness. It might be an instrument of happiness that leads me to Allah. But the real happiness is feeling and being in the presence of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. If we have ever prayed a 2 rakat namaz where we have had no distractions, then you would understand what I'm talking about. Or if you have felt that sense of contentment, that even if Allah were to take our lives today or tomorrow, we would feel happy. We would not worry about our sins. That sense of contentment is that being and presence of Allah. Ibn Sina says this is the greatest happiness in a human being's life. But he says the problem is that human beings don't recognize it. And the reason they don't recognize it is because whilst Allah is closer to human beings than their jugular veins, the problem is that human beings feel they have good health all the time. So he says that it is appropriate for a human being to fall ill, because falling ill helps one recognize health. Allah is there. I mean, we only need to reflect on His existence. But because we do not fall ill, because we don't accept the suffering or understand why that suffering is there, we fail to recognize Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Suffering helps us recognize who Allah is. Therefore, he says that we should therefore, when we are healthy and we have gone through illness, we should give our thanks to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So he says suffering is an enabling factor to recognize God and to show the limitedness and the weakness of human existence. This is the philosophy of Ibn Sina in that aspect. Ghazali says that all suffering contains an inherent goodness. So the dichotomy of good and evil is a false dichotomy. We may create evil, but even in the grand scheme of things, and other philosophers like Mullah Sadr and Iksir al-Arifin has said this. He has said that even, as I've said, when somebody insults you, it's actually a blessing, because you have the ability to be patient. And that person who insults you might actually be saying a truthful thing about you. He might be saying actually something correct about you. Now, the way he's going about it may be incorrect, but maybe he's pointing out a trait in you which actually is there. So every suffering actually contains some blessing. Now, the example that Ghazali gives is actually very simple. He says that a human being who has gangrene has to have his leg cut off for the body to survive. The apparent amputation of the leg might be an evil. I cannot walk again. But had he not amputated the leg, then the body would go and he would die, or she would die. Okay, it's a very simple example. But what he's saying is that suffering is all about our perception. You look at the fourth Imam. If the fourth Imam had not endured Karbala, we would not have had al-Sahifa al-Sajjadiyyah, which in my humble view is still underappreciated in the community. We don't teach it in madrasa, although there are many commentaries written about it. And we would not have had Risalat al-Huquq, which arguably is the second, I don't want to say human rights charter, but second rights charter after Sahifatul Madina. And that has been underappreciated by both scholars and community alike. We've got very few commentaries on Risalat al-Huquq, and we have not really developed that as a human rights legislation for the Muslim ummah. If today you were to examine human rights legislation like Cairo Declaration of Human Rights in 1990 or other human rights legislation, they are very poor, extremely poor human rights legislation. Why are they poor? Because they are constrained in a mentality which does not look at the universality of rights, the accessibility of rights. It's only concerned with Muslim rights. The greatest rights charters are those that include and help human beings realize their dignity in front of Allah. When we praise our dear Prophet for being progressive, oh, he gave rights to Christians and Jews, and he allowed them to practice their free worship. In that society, this was strange. We might be used to it now, and so we bring the example. We may go back a century, several centuries, okay? Even you want to go before Andalusia, okay? Even if you go even before that, the idea of allowing religious plurality there within society, allowing people freedom of worship, was a very new thing in the Prophet society. From tribal warfare, which you all know, tribal warfare, to respecting each other's faith, synagogue, church, mosque. Look, even within that time span of 63 years, or 40 odd years or whatever, to accomplish that is huge. When even today, as you know, Shias and Sunnis can't unite, or Christians, Jews and Muslims cannot work together to solve social problems. This is our society at the moment, right? So therefore, whether we have progressed or regressed, you can answer that, okay? But what I'm saying is that if we are to produce legislation, it has to be in the spirit of a universal vision. In Risalat al-Huquq, that kind of universal vision is there. He's talking about Allah, he's talking about rights to oneself, even of your bodily organs, the right of salah, the right of leaders. He's talking about the right of your neighbor and your business partner and your friend. And without qualification, these are not Muslims. Whoever it is, you are to respect and honor that person's right, and you have an intricate duty to that person. You can't break, promises. You can't go and insult people. Now, he's talking without qualification here. This is the key thing. This is, again, I find this very intriguing. The fourth Imam could have directed his concerns to Muslims. Oh, my family has suffered. My father has been killed. Muslims have suffered. Kufans have ignored the plea of my father. Could he not have written something just directed to Muslims? No. What was his vision? No. I'm going to elevate all layers of society. This was his vision, okay? We would not have got any of this had it not been for the suffering that he witnessed in Karbala, and how he was patient over that suffering, and how he found that resolve and positiveness to write something down and to think about it. You find prophets, but let's give the example of scholars like Mullah Sadra as an example, and there is a documentary which you can listen to on shiasource.com, something brighter than darkness, something like that, and I'd recommend you to watch that, because he was one of the few scholars, as I'm sure you know, that was basically reviled by most of the scholars in his time. The philosophy that he was coming out with, theologians didn't like it, fuqaha didn't like it. Now, due to the mercy of Allah, he's the most revered philosopher, greatest philosopher from the 16th century. How did that happen? How come people were ignorant, our own Shia scholars were ignorant to his contribution, but now he's elevated? Why is this the case? Because when his family and himself were banished to a village outside Qum, I think called Kahak, and he was there and he produced all these beautiful philosophies and works, it's because he endured that suffering. We have even recent examples like this. Even you look at Nelson Mandela, of course, who passed away recently. Suffering has this very universal quality to it. And hence, the point I'm making, when you look at the Quran or you look at the Hadith and you look at Imam Sajjad alayhi salam, it's how we respond to that suffering that determines our destiny as human beings. If Kufans had responded to the call of Imam Hussain alayhi salam, we would not have had Karbala, okay? We know that. If Kufans had responded, we may not have had Karbala. Now you may argue, but this was within the destiny of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, fine. But either way, it is within the knowledge of Allah. Nobody is disputing that. But He has given us free will. Now, if the Kufans had responded, maybe Muslims or humanity at large would be progressed to more than what we are now. Maybe we would not have had to undergo corrupt caliphates or corrupt Muslim countries that we have now. For example, the caliphates, for example, in Bahrain or other countries, stem directly from the Umayyad period. If you read their constitution, it is all about hereditary succession. They mention Sharia. Sharia is only a garb or a cover for the hereditary succession of Khulafa. Okay? So this goes directly back to the Umayyads. So there's still a link. So therefore, if you look at it, if Kufans had done something, maybe we would have been in a better position. Now you look at it another way. Karbala has happened, fine. Okay? So I have said that al-Sahifa, Risalat, al-Huquq are beautiful contributions. But still, if we are commemorating Karbala today, we still are in a position to respond to this commemoration in a victorious and positive way, so as to allow the contributions of these Imams to come out in the wider society. We know that there's a Who is Hussein campaign, which is fairly recent, 2 years ago. Why now? Why not 3-4 centuries ago? It's a historical question. Why haven't we produced a framework of justice from Imam Hussain alayhi salam? Why isn't it there? We don't have a concept of justice from Imam Hussain alayhi salam. Intellectually, I'm talking about. If you and I today have a grievance, where will we go? We'll go to the court, right? And why will we go to the court? Why won't we go to an Islamic court? Why not? Is there one? We can go to a jurist, fine, no problem. But then the jurist will give a decision, but we have to reconcile that with how we live in society. We go to a court primarily because we believe that there will be a system of justice in place through the court machinery. We believe that this society, it's not perfect, but in this society, you have a dignity. Whatever race, gender, color you are, you have a sense of dignity and legal representation. And hence, we go to court because there's a human rights standard behind that court machinery. Okay? Now, I'm just giving that example. If you look within the Islamic world, today, we've had beautiful contributions in the past, I'm not denying that, but I'm looking at today. In my humble research of Bahrain and other countries because of the Arab Spring and what has happened, if you examine their constitutions are so narrow that you will not find any justice in those Islamic constitutions at all. You will not find it. Even today, if you look at local Muslim communities, we have the ability to develop frameworks of justice and even constitutions for our jamaats. I'm giving an example. in order that a community or a Jamaat is able to reform itself and reform society. I mean, I've done a bit of research on this, I'm just sharing this. We take our constitution exactly from secular machinery. That's fine, there are positives to it. We will have, for example, trustees, president, VP, secretary, and treasurer. Where is that from? You don't have to go by that. You can go, it's very, very different ways of running a community, very different ways of catering for welfare. If you take the spirit of Letter 53, which has been underused, and you frame that, I don't have these 10 principles here, maybe in one of the lectures I can read it out. I try to derive 10 principles from that letter. You may dispute that and you might get 15, no problem. There are 10 principles, which if today Muslim and non-Muslim governments adhere to, you would not find, was it Rob Ford? Is it that guy? Yeah. Okay, we've had similar problems anyway in UK, cash for honours, government expenses scandal and things. Letter 53 is a very universal letter. You can build political frameworks and political principles from there in order to actually give a certain level of duties and rights amongst ministers as well as amongst committee members within communities in a way that not just satisfies legal rights, but in a way that touches their soul and their heart. This is very important, to touch their soul and their heart, that they don't commit a wrongdoing. We can offer this. We can offer this. We have Letter 53. We can offer this for our own communities, and we can offer this for other people. This is what I mean by building frameworks of justice. We have the capacity to do it. Why do we have that capacity? Because we have a figure like Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam. That is why, right? Allahumma salli ala. And hence, if we have that figure, we may testify to it, but we must try to realize this intricate sense of worth that the Imams left us. I don't know how much time I have. I'm going to conclude, I think, soon, before you all go to sleep. I want to end on this point, actually. I talked about Imam Sajjad enduring suffering and the fact that he was able to contribute these two works. I'm going to continue these two works over the next lectures. But if we think that suffering is something that only Muslims experience, or Karbala is something relevant to Muslims, or, you know, we have this, I don't want to say issue, but sometimes it's difficult to make an event which we hold very dear relevant to other people. Maybe we have to admit that. Karbala is something which I feel, you know, it's, you cry about. But when you want to explain that to a non-Muslim, it's a bit difficult. You have to sort of say, well, what's a Shia, and what's Imam Hussein alayhi salam, and you have to go through all of these steps, okay? But one of the things about Karbala which is so universal is the suffering, which we know, which the children, somebody like Sakina, okay, salamullahi alayha, somebody like Qasim, Ali Akbar, these beautiful children and young people that sacrifice themselves, this suffering is something universal that other people would also tap into. I want to just read out to you some quotes from non-Muslims about when suffering happened in their lives, like illness or death or whatever. This was their reaction, okay? They said, this is a summary, when I went through suffering, I gained a kind of inner stillness, which was not present before. I got emotional stability, peace, and contentment. Suffering was a gift. I don't know where that gift came from, but it was a gift given to me, and it gave me greater opportunity in life, another person says. Another person says, the disease gave me focus, determination, and meaning in my everyday activity. Before, my energies were all over the place. But now, with suffering, I diagnosed myself, and I found a beneficial way to focus my human energy. Okay? If we were able to talk about Karbala like that, okay, you would be able to reach significantly more people, but you have to develop that kind of language, and you have to develop that philosophy of suffering. In my humble view, Imam Sajjad alayhi salam arguably is the greatest Imam to do this, because he witnessed it and survived it. But we have to have that foresight of actually trying to talk about him like that. This is what I want to try to accomplish, inshallah. In just a few minutes of Maktal, inshallah. Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. I don't know if we can dim the lights or something, inshallah. Can you? Brothers and sisters, where are we after Karbala? We are at a place where Shimr has sat on al-Husayn alayhi salam's chest, and he has hacked his head off with several strokes of the knife. Zaynab salamullahi alayha is crying uncontrollably. She's running out. She's telling the rest of the camp, look, they have killed my brother. They have killed al-Husayn alayhi salam. All of the women are crying. Imam Sajjad alayhi salam is lying there. Can you imagine what they had to bear, brothers and sisters? It is reported that one of the daughters of al-Husayn alayhi salam, by the name of Fatima, who was 10 years old, she says, I was a young girl during Karbala. After the killing of my father, I was inside the tents with the rest of the women. Suddenly, a group of men entered the tents. They started plundering our belongings. A soldier attacked me and asked me to remove a golden anklet. I refused, but he took it by force. As he removed the anklet, he began to cry. I said to him, why do you cry, O enemy of Allah? He replied, how should I not cry when I'm taking the jewelry of the daughter of the Apostle of Allah as war booty? She said to him, by the love of Allah, set us free. Don't let us go through this. He says, imagine, brothers and sisters, what he says. He says, I fear somebody else will go and take your jewelry. This is how greedy he was. My mother added, they looted whatever they found inside the tent. Even the pieces of cloth that the women had tied to support their waists were snatched away from them. Lady Zaynab also says, after the killing of Hussein, I was standing at the side of a tent when a man came and took whatever he found. Imam Sajjad was unconscious with fever. He lay upon a sheet made from animal skin. The man pulled the sheet from underneath him with such force that our poor Imam fell to the ground with fever. He then turned to me as he wept and snatched away my face covering. He pulled my earrings away, tearing apart my earlobes. Lady Zaynab said, oh, you who plunder, may Allah cut off your hands, and may He cut off your feet and burn you by the fire of this world before He throws you into the pits of hell. Inna lillahi wa inna ilayhi raji'un. Matam al-Husayn.